this thing kicked off formally. Hi, everyone. I'm Don Saucier. I'm the Faculty Associate Director of the Teaching and Learning Center, and you have found our professional development series. We're going to begin today with a land acknowledgement.
Let me go ahead and share my screen with the audio. Okay, can you see the video? Okay, perfect. All right, here we go.
As the first land-grant institution established under the 1862 Morrill Act, we acknowledge that the state of Kansas is, historically, home to many native nations, including the Kaw, Osage, and Pawnee, among others. Furthermore, Kansas is the current home to 4 federally recognized native nations: the Prairie Band Potawatomi, the Kickapoo Tribe of Kansas, the Iowa Tribe of Kansas and Nebraska, and the Sac and Fox Nation of Missouri in Kansas and Nebraska.
Many native nations utilize the western plains of Kansas as their hunting grounds, and others, such as the Delaware, were moved through this region during Indian removal efforts to make way for white settlers. It's important to acknowledge this, since the land that serves as the foundation of this institution was, and still is, stolen land.
We remember these truths because K-State's status as a land-grant institution is a story that exists within ongoing settler colonialism and rests on the dispossession of indigenous peoples and nations from their lands. These truths are often invisible to many. The recognition that K-State's history begins and continues through indigenous contexts is essential.
Please remember
these truths
because we still remember.
Thank you. Our teaching, sorry, words are hard today. Our professional development series for teaching runs Wednesday at 12 noon in real time over Zoom. This same link will get you into every one of our events. If you can't be here or if a colleague can't be here, but we did something fun, all of our events are archived and can be watched asynchronously later. One of the cool things about watching some of these events, participating with us, is you can potentially earn a professional development certificate. My colleagues have just dropped the information for that into the chat. If you're a faculty or staff member, you also have the possibility of becoming one of our fellows, and that is a really cool thing. Next week's event is going to be an overview of assessment at K-State. This is going to be something done by the Director of our Office of Assessment, Dr. Fred Burrock. But today I'm super excited to say that one of my colleagues in psych sciences, one of my excellent teaching colleagues in psych sciences, Dr. Sarina Maneotis, is going to be talking to us about what job design can tell us about online teaching and learning. And I am so excited that she is here. Sarina, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, thank you for the introduction, Dawn. So I'm really excited to be here. And I shared with Dawn earlier, also a little bit nervous. So when I joined K-State in 2020, I spent quite a bit of time attending the professional development series. It was still at noon and still on Zoom in 2020. And I feel like I benefited a lot from that. And so it's really quite nice to be able to come back and speak at one of these events and share some of my experiences with you. What I tried to do when I was putting together my thoughts on what I could share for online teaching tips, I tried to reflect on maybe what I bring to the table that could be a little bit unique from maybe some of the other things that you're already doing or the way that you're already thinking about things. So I kind of went back to my field, which is industrial organizational psychology, and pulled from some job design and motivational frameworks because I do tend to think about my classes and my job using these frameworks. So with that being said, I do have some slides. I will go ahead and share those if that's all right. I encourage any questions that you might have during the presentation, and I'll try to save a little bit of time at the end for questions as well. And I will also try to keep an eye on the chat, but if anyone notices there's something in the chat that I haven't got to yet, feel free to give me a shout and remind me of that. All right, so I think I shared a little bit about me. Sarina Maneotis, I'm a teaching assistant professor in psychological sciences. I noted that I joined the program in 2020, and part of my role includes directing and teaching an mostly online master's program. So I do teach online classes most semesters for the university. We'll talk a little bit about what job design is, and then I'll really break down the definitions of each of the job design components and provide some ideas for how I think that this can be applied to online teaching and learning. Any framework or theory, of course, has limitations. So we'll talk about what some of those limitations are and acknowledge some of the things that this framework maybe doesn't help with or doesn't explain all that well. I'll provide some notes on some supporting ideas and approaches that I think are helpful. And then, like I said, I'll try to leave a little bit of time at the end for questions. But if you have questions throughout, I am very happy to pause and answer those. So my last name is pronounced Maneotis, and I just provide that because I know that that is a little bit of a tricky one. So if that helps. My background is in industrial organizational psychology, and this is a very small area within the larger field of psychology. It has a big name, but essentially what we do is we focus on trying to understand employees and people at work. So some IO psychologists will study things like motivation, others will focus on leadership, some will focus on teams or culture, safety and well-being are also topics that we focus on. Really trying to achieve this balance of helping organizations be effective and efficient so they can continue operations, but also taking into consideration employee needs and trying to construct jobs and support systems that help benefit people as well. So before I dive into what job design is, I wanted to see if anyone had any specific concerns or worries that you experience when you're thinking about developing or delivering online content.
Hi, Sarina. I'll jump in with a couple questions that I hear a lot, and I definitely had myself a lot. And a couple of questions are, how do you keep the students on pace? How do you keep them caught up? And how do you make it fulfilling for you? It's a little bit different than the online experience, the in-person experience. So how's it going to make good for you? And how do you make sure your students don't get behind?
Yeah, I like that. I think Jack in the chat kind of had a similar sentiment. So how do we make sure that they're not falling behind? And that can be a little bit hard to gauge. Student engagement was another one, and then connection. So there's kind of these elements, kind of a social element, right? So how do we have these connections that maybe we tend to enjoy or tend to maybe perceive as being easier in-person environments? And then how do we ensure that we're managing our class in a way that doesn't allow people to fall behind, make sure that they're following along with the content, engaging with the content, and doing what they need to do. And I would say that those are, of course, very valid, and I would say probably pretty common concerns when you're thinking about, again, developing an online class for the first time or even implementing a class that you've done before. So hopefully some of the things that I'm going to talk about with job design today will help give you some ideas for some of these barriers or hurdles that you worry about with online education. So what we're going to be talking about today is job design. This is a theory or a framework that is rooted in employee motivation. Basically, the overarching goal of job design is to try to create positions, tasks, things like that boost satisfaction, support intrinsic motivation, and ultimately lead to high levels of performance. Job design doesn't happen in a vacuum, of course. So other things like support networks in organizations, leadership practices, culture, things like that are still important. In our classrooms, our leadership as an instructor and the culture, the tone that we set within our classroom is also still going to be important. So the reason why I wanted to talk about job design with you all is I feel like it is a helpful organizing framework when you might be feeling a little bit overwhelmed with all of the choices that you have available to you in developing and delivering online education. So this might be a way of sort of organizing those choices and thinking about maybe trying to pull a choice from like each bucket. I also tend to think that a lot of the recommendations that you probably have already been hearing at the Teaching and Learning Center events are supported or potentially explained in some part by job design frameworks and motivation frameworks. So I think it kind of supports some of the recommendations that you might already be familiar with. And I think that this applies not only to how we think about building and delivering our classes, but I think it can apply to our own positions as well. And throughout, I'll refer to teaching positions as instructor positions, and that's meant to be sort of a catch-all, and of course would encompass anyone who does have the job title of instructor or teaching, faculty, professor, teaching assistant, things like that. All right, so this is what the framework looks like. We'll kind of build it out on the slides step by step. So we start with these characteristics of jobs, or in this case, this might be our job as an instructor, or it could be the job of our students in the classroom. So there are 5 characteristics. The first is skill variety. The second is task identity. The third is task significance. And you'll notice these are all orange because they're grouped together. The next one is autonomy. And then the last one is feedback. So in the following slides, I'm going to break down what each of these are in a lot more detail and provide examples about what these might look like for your role and for your students. For now, we're going to focus on the fact that these do have some groupings. So the part of the reason why research has demonstrated that these components do in fact support intrinsic motivation, support satisfaction, support performance is through several psychological states. So the first 3 group together to help support your experiences of feeling meaningful, so having important contributions. Autonomy leads directly to feeling responsible and being responsible for your choices and your outcomes. And then feedback leads to the experience of knowledge of results. So understanding where you are, how well you did, what you might want to work on in the future. And collectively, these characteristics and these psychological states that they lead to, again, support satisfaction, intrinsic motivation, performance, and things like that. Desirable outcomes, essentially. So we'll talk about each of the 5 characteristics in more detail. So the first one is skill variety. And skill variety is focused on the extent to which the position requires several different skills or abilities to be used, again, throughout various tasks. An example of low skill variety would be working on a research project in which you are only conducting the literature review. So you're not involved in the other steps, and really you're sort of using this same skill over and over again to identify articles, potentially to summarize them and integrate them. So there are a couple of different skills there, but not as many as would be required for that entire process. An example of something that would require high skill identity includes designing and implementing the full research project. So not only would you need the skills involved to conduct the literature review, but you would also need to design data collection, analyze data, and then communicate that as well. So a lot more variety there, a lot more chance for skill development, for practice, and really refinement of skills that you might have already or students might have already. So for each of these, I'm going to walk through some examples that you might be able to incorporate in your classes to help support student skill variety in this case. And then on the next slide, we'll talk about how you can incorporate that to your own role to ensure that your own role stays interesting and exciting and motivating for you. So one potential idea here is to vary the ways in which students are learning the information. So some of the information might be presented in a written format. So maybe some readings, maybe things that you type out and publish on Canvas for them to look over. Other ways to communicate information might be recording of a PowerPoint, much like we're doing now. Although you could also add a talking head or just have it be the talking head and have it be really conversational with yourself sort of explaining some concepts to the students. You might bring in some guest speakers or have an interview situation where you're having a conversation that's being demonstrated for the students, or other content that's already been developed, such as resources available on YouTube. So that offers some skill variety because you're processing that information in different ways depending on how it's being presented. A really good strategy, I think, in this area is to mix up the type of tasks that students are completing. So the different types of assignments that you might be building and the ways that you're assessing them or the ways that they're earning points in classes. So if you have the opportunity to take the material that students are learning and applying it to a real scenario, that again helps support skill variety and skill development. Maybe in addition to that, they're summarizing their experiences by creating a presentation that's delivered back to the class or delivered back to the instructor. Maybe you'd like to support their skill development by encouraging them to explore a new technology that they incorporate into their response. So maybe you encourage them to figure out a new way to record a video or a new way to ask a question for the audience that they must be able to demonstrate in what you're assessing them on. You might vary the types of assignments that students are working on. So some of them might require, a discussion board and a written response. Others might require a video response or a presentation or something else that, again, allows them to practice a variety of different skills. I would recommend Bloom's taxonomy as an additional tool to sort of think about the different types of tasks or assessments that you might be able to incorporate into your classes as well. And then it might be important to also consider what skills are required for students going into this particular topic area as their career, or even what they're going to need for the next class for their degree progress. So making sure that you're giving them opportunity to develop those specific skills. For your own role as an instructor, there are certainly ways for you to engage in skill variety as well. So the practice of communicating to your students through some different modalities, again, written communication, verbal communication, through video technology and things like that. With online education, I think there's always opportunity to learn new technologies, and sometimes that can be frustrating, but sometimes that can also be exciting. So sort of using that as an opportunity to learn something that you might be interested in and giving it a try. And it could end up being something that you incorporate not only in the class, but in other areas of your role as well. Using your course as an opportunity to research new information, bring in new articles that you haven't looked at yet, new case studies or other things that you yourself are interested in for your role as well. And then I think the act of designing and executing a variety of different assessments or assignment types can help support your skill variety as well. Some things that would be important to consider when you're trying to figure out if this is something that you need to build more of into your class. Think about the skills that your entire position requires from you and how you can apply skills that you're using in other areas of your job into your teaching. Think about what skills you are interested in developing for yourself and how you might use your course to help sort of encourage that time that you need to take to develop those skills. And then finally, considering too how the skills that you're honing as an instructor can be applied to the other areas of your role to support the rest of your position as well. So skill variety is a pretty big one. We're going to move into task identity next. Task identity is the extent to which students or yourself is working on an entire identifiable project from start to finish. So low task identity would be chunking out a project and assigning those individual chunks to students, and then sort of having them push all of those chunks up against each other at the end for a final project. So students would only be working on one piece, and they wouldn't really be working on the whole project together, if that makes sense. And of course, that doesn't mean that that's the only way to assign group work, but that just happens to be an example of a way to split up group work where the task identity would be fairly low. High task identity on the other hand would be having a project where students work on the whole thing. Or for yourself, it would even potentially be designing a lesson or a module, designing the assessment or the activity that goes with that, implementing it, designing the rubric, and grading it as well. So there's, your hand is in the entire process. For students, I think task identity is really strongly supported by tools like scaffolding. So sort of starting with one content area and building up from that into, again, this sort of identifiable whole process. Final projects can be a great way to incorporate task identity, where students have to use the skills or the content that they've been learning throughout the semester in sort of this one, again, overall project or overall identifiable piece. Some other ways that you might be able to support task identity include focusing on how what you're learning fits within the topic area overall or the field overall. So sometimes, you know, depending on the topic area, you might feel limited in exposing students to the entire process. But again, you can kind of zoom out and still talk about how what you're doing now fits within the greater whole to kind of encourage that perspective. And then finally, if you're, again, not able to have students work on an entire process, allowing them feedback or other choices or discussion around parts of the project that maybe aren't as feasible for them to work on within the duration of the class or within the confines of the time and resources that you have. I think for your own positions, it can be helpful to be involved in multiple processes throughout your course design and implementation. And I suspect that for most of you, this is probably already the case. So again, recognizing that you have the opportunity to identify the learning objectives for your course, to decide the timeline for when you're studying what, to develop the assessments and all of that. And again, that all supports task identity to a very large extent. Some other ideas include collaborating with other faculty. So maybe that's faculty that teach the same section of, or a different section of the class that you're teaching. Maybe they teach the class that students are taking before yours or after yours, and sort of trying to understand from the student perspective what the whole series would look like or what the degree progress would look like, so that those can be fit together in a way that makes sense. And then if you are working with a teaching assistant, supporting them to have some ownership for working on the entire process as well. So if you have a topic area where they can sort of take the lead on that and get some practice identifying the learning objectives, developing the content, creating a task or an assessment to go with that, rather than maybe just grading for most of the semester. The third characteristic that we're going to talk about is task significance. And so this is the extent to which what students are working on or what employees are working on has an impact on other people. So the other people can be colleagues, it can be clients, it can be customers, it could be other students in the class, but you're sort of having this impact on the people around you. So an example of a task that would have low significance would be an individual writing up a reflection about a reading that they have. So that's kind of maybe focused on their own experiences of that reading. And that's not to say that that type of activity doesn't have value. It just might not be super high on task significance. An example of a project that would be quite high on task significance includes a service learning project where students are working on something that's delivered back out to the community. So that I think that impact on the work that they're doing would be extremely clear in that case, especially because they have this client essentially that their work is going to benefit. So supporting this in students might include things like highlighting the benefits of what they're doing. So talking about how, you know, this topic area, this field has benefited other people, how it's benefited students of yours or students of your programs in the past, again, to sort of demonstrate this is important and this can have an impact. And maybe we don't actually have the ability to do a service learning project in this class, but there's still some importance in what we're learning because it can be implemented in ways that help other people. Building opportunities for student-to-student interaction or student-to-instructor interaction can help support this as well. So allowing them opportunities to talk to one another, to work with one another, to work on a project together. And again, making that benefit very clear. So you're working together as a team. Let's talk about the benefits of working as a team. Let's talk about how we support one another and positively impact one another. Students could also do a reflection on their experiences working with one another and how they were able to help a teammate or a peer in some way. And again, this isn't necessarily something that will work in every class, but this would be an option that could work in some classes. An additional thing that you might do is sort of being really clear about how the information is benefiting students or benefiting other people at the beginning of the semester. So, hey, we're going to learn about this. This is how this information can be used in the real world. This is how it can be helpful. This is how it can apply to benefit you, yourself, or an organization, other people. And then reminding students of that again at the end of the semester. So these are all the cool things that we learned in this class. And as a reminder, this is the benefit of that knowledge or the benefit of the skills that you've developed. And then finally, where possible, you could consider allowing students to have a choice in what type of topic they're going to be focusing on, maybe what type of task that they're working on, but then also asking them to explain that choice. So why did you pick that? And then how do you think that's benefiting your development, or how do you think that would benefit others in your future career by having this information or this experience? For instructors, I personally feel like my job probably has quite a bit of task significance, and that's part of why I enjoy it. I feel like I'm able to develop my classes and connect with students in a way that I feel is meaningful and allows me to feel like I am having an impact on other people. But there are specific things that we can do, of course, to support that as well. So try to help get that information back if you don't feel like you're seeing a lot of feedback in how your work is helping or supporting students. So ask for feedback, whether that's informally, whether that's for points through like a discussion board or an assignment. It could even be like an informal survey or a poll that you develop, just again, kind of source that feedback to understand how the class is going, how, students are, benefiting from it, what they'd like to see differently, what's going well, again, to get that information on the impact that you're having and the class is having on students. And then, of course, you can make adjustments as needed. Kind of a similar idea is taking measures of the students from the beginning to the end of the semester. So this is something that I like to do in some of my courses, where we'll sort of have this baseline survey at the beginning of the semester, and they tell me their confidence or their self-rated skill in a certain, topic area. And then we'll run the same survey at the end of the semester. It's very informal, but we'll be able to sort of see on our little bar graphs, like the increase in these confidence ratings or these skill ratings. And I think that helps students understand that they're learning a lot in any given semester, but I think it helps me appreciate that we've done a lot and that students have, in fact, learned quite a bit of information, which is a win for me. Build in opportunities to communicate directly with your students. So maybe this is through discussion boards. You could even use feedback on assignments as a way to sort of communicate with students, little comments, on their work, like, oh, hey, yeah, you did a really good job here. Or if they're talking about, other things happening and incorporating that into the assignment, like, oh, I didn't know you got a promotion. That's great. So again, those opportunities to sort of communicate and connect. Another recommendation that I had years ago was, when you're managing your inbox, creating a folder to save all of the nice things that you hear from people. So if you have that student that emails you at the end of the semester and was like, thanks, I really enjoyed your class. And it can be short and simple like that. It doesn't have to be like paragraphs long. Saving it. It feels really good the first time you read it, but there might be days when you need to revisit those encouraging emails, right? Maybe if it's not a great day, you kind of have that set aside and you can kind of remember that you are having a positive impact. And then finally, another way to incorporate this would be supporting other people where possible. So if you are new to online education, it's very easy and common to feel sort of overwhelmed as you're developing those classes and delivering them for the first time. But eventually you will get to the point where you have quite a bit of expertise and sort of recognizing if somebody is new, maybe sitting down with them, having a cup of coffee, making some recommendations, asking how things are going. And again, trying to have a positive impact in that regard. The next thing we're going to talk about is autonomy. Just like it sounds, autonomy is the extent to which individuals can decide how, when, and what tasks they're working on. Again, within a job or within a class. So an example of something that would be relatively low in autonomy would be a requirement to create a discussion post on a specific topic within a specific window of time. Again, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't use that tool in your class. It's just a tool that in this case might be a little bit lower in autonomy. Something that would be high in autonomy would be allowing the student to pick their topic of choice for an assessment or a project or an assignment, or allowing them to pick how they're presenting that. So you can write up a paper that I read. If you'd rather record a video, you could do that. You could make some slides that you're presenting. You get the option of telling me and communicating to me what you did this semester. For students, anytime that you are able to allow choice, and again, this doesn't mean that every week they get a choice or whatnot, but if there's a couple of things that they can have a little bit of that control back and have a choice, that could be picking between a couple of assignment types or between a couple of topics. It doesn't have to be free range always, but sort of allowing a choice where choice is possible and appropriate. For, specific assignments, you might say, you can write your paper on this, or you can have a full range of topics that you pick from. Sometimes I like to incorporate, a week where maybe every student picks a different topic from a list, and then they get to be the expert on that topic. So they come up with the information that we all should be responsible for knowing. And that can be really nice because that might save me a little bit of time in pulling together all of those resources, but it also gives a lot of ownership to the students for being responsible for that particular information. For instructors, for our jobs, I think a lot of positions in higher ed do tend to be relatively high on autonomy. That doesn't mean that all positions are, or that they are to the same extent. But, we do tend to have a lot of control over how we're developing our courses, how we're implementing those, the types of assessments that we're using. And so I think that that's absolutely something that is to be celebrated, and just kind of reminding ourselves that yes, not every single thing that we do at work is within our control. Sometimes we feel like there are things we have to do, but that we should focus maybe on the things that we can control and the decisions that we do get to make within our courses or within our positions. Again, remembering that you can choose the different strategies, topics, assignment types that fit within your role. Remembering that because you're the instructor, you tend to get more control over the schedule. So this is more of a reminder to me maybe than everyone else, but not scheduling all of your final projects to be due at the same week at the end of the semester, because that's a lot of grading. So again, kind of reminding yourself that I have control over this and I can prevent a week like that from happening to the extent that I'm able to plan ahead and set different due dates. And then finally, remembering that you do get some control into your personal preferences and what you want from your class, and what works, for some instructors won't necessarily work for others, but you do get to consider what your preferences are and what, would work well for your students. All right, so we're on to the last one. The last characteristic is feedback. And this is, again, like it sounds, the extent to which information about performance is made clear and also provided in a timely manner. So one example of low feedback would be a class that awards participation points based on the number of comments that are made in a discussion or something like that. But that this is sort of vague and there's not a lot of feedback. And so at the end of the semester, students might be awarded points for their participation, but they don't really know until that point where their participation level is. There's no sort of feedback or check-in provided. An example of high feedback would be students getting multiple responses on a discussion post that they've made. So maybe you require at least 2 responses, and then the instructor goes in and responds to each individual student as well. So again, that student is hearing from a lot of other people and getting some feedback on their ideas that they're sharing. So when we consider how we can design our classes to make sure that students are getting feedback, I think always just keeping in mind that anything that we're assigning, we do need to provide some type of feedback on. So assigning points for things that need points, but also providing comments or other sort of narrative feedback to let students know where they stand or what they might change, what they're doing well, and things like that. And then to the extent that we're able, trying to turn that around in a timely manner as well. And again, I know, especially when we're grading like longer papers, that just takes longer. And so maybe the solution there is just communicating, hey, I want to be able to do a thorough job, leaving you feedback. So this is going to take X period of time, right? If you have a rubric, providing a rubric can be one way to have a lot of structure in the feedback that you're providing. Or again, you can be providing comments on things that are submitted through Canvas as well. If you are doing that, it's important to remind students how to access their feedback. So I have found that sometimes I will spend a lot of time providing feedback, and then students forget that they need to click back into the assignment that they've submitted to see the comments that I've left in it. So sort of reminding them how you're going to be giving them feedback, and then reminding them to go look at it throughout the semester so that they're getting that information that you're wanting to provide to them. I think we're all aware of this, but especially when we need to provide constructive feedback, also letting the students know what they're doing well so that they can continue doing those things and then maybe modify things that they need to change. And then another strategy that can be helpful is compiling high levels feedback and providing it to the class through an email or an announcement. So, hey, I noticed these trends in what you submitted last week. Wanted to share those notes with everyone. And those could be things that you've already left on individual assignments, but again, you're kind of sharing them at a high level with the entire class so that they know that, like, yes, you did in fact look at it. Yes, you've sort of taken in that information and thought about it, and again, are providing that feedback. For your particular positions, I think, again, kind of creating opportunities for communication with students to get information on how they think the class is going. So what's going well, what might need to change, is the pace okay? Is the organization okay? Is anything confusing? You can invite those comments informally through like email. Maybe there's a mid-semester and early semester check-in. Potentially it's for points or not. You could do an anonymous survey. There's a good variety there. This won't come until the end of the semester, but you can add open-ended questions to your TVAL as well. So what is something that worked well about this class that I should keep doing? And then what is something that you would recommend I change about this class? And I like to word my questions that way. What would you change about this class? So it's not terribly negative, right? Like, what did you not like about this class? Because sometimes those comments aren't constructive. But when you're asking them what should be changed, I feel like the feedback ends up being a little bit more constructive. And then finally, using the assignments to gauge how the content is hitting. So maybe you developed something that you didn't think was terribly challenging, but for whatever reason, it looks like it just didn't hit right, and students were confused and they weren't able to complete the assignment to the level that you thought that they would be able to. Using that piece of information and understanding that potentially an adjustment might need to be made, maybe some more detail is needed, maybe some further clarification is needed. Okay, so that was probably quite a bit of information on these 5 different areas that we could potentially focus on when we're building an online class for the first time, or when we're thinking about maybe some tweaks that we might be making to classes that we've already developed. But this isn't exhaustive. So I'm wondering if you've had any thoughts as you've been listening to this on what's missing. So what is this not accounting for? What else should be considered for designing or changing classes?
So Sarina, I'm having a hard time kind of focusing on what's missing, because I saw this as a fairly comprehensive framework to come at your class from a lot of different ways. I think the thing that I'll kind of offer, and I think it was touched on some of these, but inspiring that trust and connection in our students that this is going to work out for them. And I think, some of this does touch on that, but I wonder if you could talk about that point maybe a little bit more explicitly and directly.
So trusting that the class is going to work out with them.
So trusting that the class has been designed in a way that it's going to help inspire their learning and help their, because I think what I really like about this framework is it's intentional, and it's intentional from a lot of different ways, but how do we let students in on that, and how do we make that connection explicit for them?
Yeah. I mean, off the top of my head, I would say letting them know, like sharing your decision process. Like, I am having us cover this before this other topic because of this reason, or I am asking you to do this assignment for this reason, and just kind of sharing your thought process. And what I personally find helpful is if you've taught the class a couple times, you can also throw in the past, this has worked well, or in the past, I've tried it differently and it didn't work well. So we're going to try it a new way, or, something like that, where you can kind of start to incorporate experience. And of course, that's going to be a lot more difficult the first couple of times, but if you've done the class a few times, you might also have that experience to draw on.
And related to that, do you find that coming at it from this conceptualization, does it make the initial prep of a course harder or easier? Because I could kind of see it going either way. It seems like once it's in place, it would work pretty well. But do you think this is going to kind of, for a new instructor, is this something to do, or is this something to kind of add in later? Maybe I'll ask a question like that.
That's a really good question. I would say for a new instructor, think about it a little bit. And especially think about it if you get to the place where you're like, gosh, I'm 6 weeks into the semester and every single assessment this week or for my topics has been a discussion board. Is there anything else I could do, or anything different that I could incorporate to get some more variety into the class and maybe support some of these different components? And that could even be like changing up the way that you're doing the discussion boards, because maybe that's like a really good fit for what you're doing, but maybe again, for some of the skill variety, maybe sometimes it's written response and sometimes it's a video response. So kind of thinking about, getting out of that rinse and repeat cycle a little bit and challenging yourself to incorporate even just one thing that's a little bit different. I do think that that's probably something that's easier after you've built the course, to go back, the second or the third time and think, okay, well, I had a lot of this. Maybe I need to pull from one of these other 4 areas a little bit more next time.
And part of my reason for asking the question, this is not just to Sarina, but to the rest of the audience, is I know that teaching is daunting, especially if you haven't done it very much. So I don't want anyone to feel like, oh my God, I could never do that, right? These are gradual processes. And I'm not going to speak for Sarina, but I'll say the things I do now were not things I did very early in my teaching career. They're things I kind of figured out later. Do you ever get resistance, Sarina, for people kind of who want the rinse and repeat, who want it to be the same way, who want to kind of have a more narrow conceptualization about what the class has to offer, that would interact with the class in these very predictable, very routine ways? Do you ever have any resistance to kind of trying to increase that variety?
Yeah, so we'll kind of talk about that as a limitation, and I think we're starting to touch on it now. This model does suggest that you could do all kinds of different things, but more isn't always more. So I think that there is definitely a lot of value in being consistent as well, especially consistent in clear communications, consistent sort of overall schedule for your course. So each week we read something, or we watch a lecture, we have an assignment, and we have a quiz, right? And so kind of having that routine and that expectation, I think, can be helpful. And then I think the goal is you're kind of balancing that with, okay, well, maybe this week we're working on this type of assignment, next week we're doing something different, or this week we're working on this piece, and then next week we're going to work on the second piece that goes along with it, and now they fit together and we're working more towards the whole process.
Excellent. There's a statement in the chat that said the syllabus is a good way to get in the course after a good start, which I think we would agree with. And then Ashley asked, do you have different recommendations for the components of job design in intro level versus upper level courses?
Yeah, so I'm trying to think. Things like autonomy might be a little bit easier in an upper level course than an entry level course. it could look a little bit different too. So maybe in an entry level course, it's, hey, this week you can write about this topic or this topic, right? And so you kind of give them two good options, and they can pick between those, but the choices are relatively limited. Whereas maybe in an upper level class, you say, okay, so we're going to write a research proposal. You can pick any research topic that you would like. And maybe that autonomy is a lot higher. The options are a lot more varied. So again, that might look a little bit different, but maybe still trying to incorporate that to a certain extent.
Excellent. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So some other things that might be missing that you might have thought of or not shared or might click when you see it on this slide. There's not really a great way to incorporate individual differences in this model. So the researchers who developed it did suggest one individual difference, and they called that growth need strength. Essentially, what they thought is that people who are higher in a need to have growth activities and learning and development activities will benefit more from this type of enrichment than people who are lower in that attribute. But that's only one individual difference, so it doesn't really take into account the fact that the way that you're trying to deliver an autonomy in your class might work better for some students than other students. There's very limited social components to the original framework. So when we think about, trying to have an impact on other people, I feel like that can absolutely be social, but otherwise it doesn't have a lot of the interactive components that modern classes or modern jobs would have, and that's certainly a limitation. And then finally, again, kind of going back to the more is not always more, I think you can have maybe a little bit too much of this to the point that it could become a little bit stressful or just a lot of work. And so I think that there's a little bit of some balance that needs to be achieved. If you can strike that balance, more modern research does suggest that having these sort of 5 characteristics present can in fact help reduce, reduce employee burnout and help lower stress. But again, I think that needs to be in moderation as well. So we could kind of, pick places where maybe we add some of the social components or the individual components or the additional outcomes like stress and burnout that are sort of missing from the existing framework. So as I've mentioned several times, I want to fully recognize that more is not always more. So if right now you're feeling like, do I really have to do all of this? The answer is no. I think this framework sort of helps you group the whole cafeteria of options available to you. So if you're in a place where you're like, I would like to add something different, I would like to change something, sort of looking at your 5 different groupings and figuring out, I have a lot of this one, maybe I should add more of the second one. But again, I think if you tried to maximize all of these at the same time, it could get a little bit unwieldy. With that in mind, of course, there's no one perfect way to design a course. This will vary and should vary by the instructor, by the students, by the topic area, by the level of the course. And that is totally okay. So it's not a global set of recommendations for all of your courses have to look exactly like this. Not all of the components will be equally easy to apply for all instructors, for all students, for all classes. Again, I think it's helpful to think of these as options available to you that you might consider. But again, you don't have to try to maximize all 5 of them at the same time. Okay, so some supporting approaches. I think the syllabus was mentioned earlier as a really good organizing framework, and I would absolutely agree with that. Having some sort of structure, so we're not just trying to have all the variety, but we're also trying to have structure, maybe in the timing of our communication. So we always communicate on Mondays and Fridays with students. What we're generally doing. So we're learning something, we're applying it, we're having a quiz, right, each week. So sort of including that structure and that routine as well. Having really clear expectations. Part of this is our communication with students. Part of this might be sharing a rubric that goes with an assignment before the students turn it in. Again, so students sort of know what to expect. To Dawn's question earlier, maybe sharing our thought process as well. So I've designed it this way because of these reasons. I think, I think the slides talked about this a little bit already, but getting input, whether that's sourcing ideas at teaching and learning events or directly from your students, I think is a good idea. Coming to these events and getting a sense of the options available, I think is helpful. But also keeping in mind that you have the autonomy in your class. You ultimately get to decide what's going to work well for your teaching style, for your students, for your topic area. And so again, I think it's helpful to look at the whole variety of options available to you, but then also remember, you don't have to do all of them. You do get to pick what you think is going to work best for you and for your students. All right. So I'll go ahead and stop sharing and pause there and see if anyone has any additional questions, comments, or anything else that they'd like to talk about.
Sarina, I have a question. Specific to the providing feedback to students. So I've noticed this is more even in my in-person classes, but teaching like first-year students in general psychology, I'll leave feedback on their assignments with the hopes that they're actually reviewing it and incorporating into future assignments. I felt like even though I was telling them that I was doing this, that it was important to me and showing them where to look for it, they weren't really looking for it and they definitely weren't incorporating it. So I was wondering if you had any like creative ways to empower or encourage students to check that feedback, or just any recommendations you have for that?
Yeah, so one thing that I do is I actually have a video that I use for all of my classes that's, hey, here's how you look at your feedback. So that if they happened to, like if you're doing an in-person class and they happen to miss the class where you went over that, it's available on Canvas. And it's always in like the first module with the syllabus and other things. And it's like, this is where you go to look at your feedback. I would say if it's a really big problem, you could get a little bit creative and maybe do like a couple points assignment or an extra credit assignment where it's like, tell me what feedback I left for you on the most recent assignment. And that might kind of encourage or motivate them to go look at it for some extra points. The other thing would be if you're sort of like scaffolding or progressing where maybe what they're working on in week one builds into something that they're working on later, and you do really need them to incorporate that feedback, having part of the subsequent assignment be answering the question, how did you incorporate the feedback from the earlier assignment, so that they very clearly have to address that.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Sarina, it's funny you mentioned videos like that. We have a video in one of my classes about this is how to succeed in the class, and it's actually considered testable content. And so far, 30 of my 200 students have watched it. Oh. So it's like we couldn't be clearer that we think this is going to be helpful for you.
Yeah.
Other questions for Dr. Maneotis? All right. Well, please join me one more time for thanking Dr. Maneotis for this very excellent presentation. Sarina, would you be willing to share those slides for us and we could post them with your presentation?
Absolutely. Yep.
That would be fantastic. I'd like to remind the rest of you, remember that this series meets every Wednesday. Next Wednesday, Fred Burach from our Office of Assessment will be talking about an overview of assessment at K-State. And I'm really excited. In 2 weeks, we got another teaching chat. This year in our teaching chats, we have kind of a primary topic. So we'll have, we'll be open to anything that y'all want to bring and want to crowdsource. But our primary topic for that week is active learning techniques. So anything that you're using in your class that's really excellent and inspiring students engaging in learning, bring that. Because what I'm really hoping for is that I'm going to fill out my arsenal from all of the wonderful ideas that y'all have. So I'm really looking forward to have lots of people share lots of cool things in their classes 2 weeks from now. We have a post-event survey that's just been dropped into the chat. We hope you peek at that. And again, thank you so much for being here, and I hope you have a great rest of your afternoon. Thank you.